Now, I'm not going to go quiet on this crazy debate about bushfires and climate. Too many journalists are giving credence to this debate. Too many are entertaining the comments of the Greens and others as somehow defensible when they are clearly offensive and so idiotic it's impossible to justify anyone taking them seriously. Let's have a listen again to inner-city Melbourne Greens MP Adam Bandt doubling down on his madness on ABC Radio this morning.
Well, this government's been in power now for 6 years, and what's happened during that time is that they've come up with so-called climate policies that have helped deliver this kind of scenario.
This bloke is seriously trying to pretend that anything any government has done in the past 6 years has contributed to the fire danger today. No, he's not talking about failure to clear the bush to implement hazard reduction burns. He's talking about climate. These nutters constantly tell us to follow the science. Well, the facts and the science tell us this. There is nothing any state or federal government has done in the past 6 years, in the past 20 years, in the past 50 years that could have had any impact on our climate for good or bad. That is impossible. We make up just over 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So Bandt's claim to pin the blame on his political opponents for deadly bushfires is as stupid and as absurd as it is offensive. But he goes further.
Barely 11 days after the Port Arthur massacre, John Howard came up with a gun control agreement. Scott Morrison could have a national climate agreement before the end of the year. If Scott Morrison took a leaf out of John Howard's book, he could say these terrible tragedies are something we should do everything in our power to avoid happening ever again, and that means coming up with a plan to get out of coal and minimise the risk of terrible fires like this ever happening again.
All the stupids. This bloke is suggesting there are policies the Australian government can implement that can make our springs and summers cooler and wetter. No scientist would be silly enough to make such a claim. Even if we accept that lower emissions might make a difference overall, we could shut down and shut out all the emissions in this country, reduce ourselves to zero emissions. And in a decade, there would still be no change in any climate anywhere in the world because global emissions still would have increased. These people are selling lunacy, and they're selling it on the back of lost properties and deaths. Yes, we have an early fire season because we are in a drought, a very bad drought. In some areas, it's the worst since the Federation drought. There's your clue. We had as bad or worse in the 1890s and 1900s. And our preeminent climate scientist has told us in emphatic terms there's no direct link between drought and climate change. There's no long-term drying trend in the Australian rainfall data. In fact, all the IPCC modelling says rather logically, if you give it more than a moment's thought, that if the planet warms, there will be more rain, not less. So on every level, Bandt, Di Natale and their Labor supporters too, and the activists and many journalists who are running this sort of silly line, they are talking absolute nonsense. It insults the intelligence of every Australian. It ignores the wisdom of everyone with bushfire experience in this country who know the very real and terrifying threat of bushfires in this country every summer, every year for time immemorial. It holds out cruel and ridiculously false hope that somehow, sometime in some greeny nirvana future, we will, for the first time, not have deadly bushfire threats in the hot months in this country. And worst of all, it seeks to exploit a regular and horrific disaster that's still ongoing, a threat to all of us this summer, for a cheap, opportunistic political goal.